Welcome to Ask the FM Doctor, an interactive web series brought to you by the Simplard Foundation and IFMA to help you navigate the complex and ever-changing world of facility management. Whether you're a seasoned professional or a newcomer to the field, you'll find valuable insights and tips to deliver a better experience for your stakeholders while saving money. Join us on the third Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern U.S. time to learn from our FM docs while connecting with other facility managers from around the world. Register today at simplerfoundation.org/FM-doctor so you don't miss an upcoming session.
We'll go ahead and dive into today's presentation. Again, my name is Jake Smithwick, and we all sincerely appreciate you being here today. Today's topic is going to be developing an effective statement of work for operations and service contracts. As with any of our discussions, our Ask the FM Doctors, we'll definitely watch the chat box. I see we have Derek Hillestead here. He's one of our other FM doctors, so be sure to type in the chat box. Derek will watch that and certainly respond and provide comments here. So our agenda, we're going to talk about why the statement of work is so important. We'll talk about how it's a balance between too prescriptive and overly prescriptive, and also provide some tips and specific recommendations on how we can actually better write our statements of work. So keep that in mind as we go through and work on that. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind with this is that as a vendor, there's always many fish in the sea, as it were, right? There's always options and available opportunities out here. What we need to do, especially given today's market, is to make sure that we stand out to the industry. So if I'm a vendor looking to propose on a project, we want to be attractive, right? We have lots of projects here now, and it's frankly quite a struggle to get people sometimes to be interested in our projects, because if we look dangerous, obviously it's going to encourage the vendors and suppliers not to propose on our projects here. So at the end of the day, what we need to focus on is how do we attract more high-performing vendors on our projects? That's the fundamental question and goal that we have here as we think about our project as we go forward with this, right? It starts with your solicitation. That's the key of all this, is having a good, solid RFP is going to make sure that this entire process is effective, that people actually enjoy it, and they actually propose on our projects. Now, we think about a good quality RFP, or request for proposals. There's really two main parts to this. Now, we're not going to go through each of these in detail here, but the first part of this is focused on what are we actually buying as a client or as a customer? What are we buying? The second part of this is focused on how we're going to evaluate and ensure that we're going to actually deliver something that meets the intent of what we are buying here, right? So that's kind of how we're thinking about this as we go forward and as we get this set up, right? There's lots of different terminology here in terms of RFPs, statement of work, ITBs, whatever you have here, it's all a different type of solicitation, right? Now, when you think about an RFP, or specifically a statement of work, the goal of this is to paint the picture of what we want, right? Now, let's take a quick pause here. Does anybody like Bob Ross? Anybody watched that growing up, right? Or seen it in the past? Amazing painter, right? Does really good work here. And it's amazing to watch his efforts to come to fruition in terms of when a painting happens, right? Well, our statement of work is the same idea, is that we want to deliver something that people can actually understand what's happening. And what this does, more importantly, is it convinces the vendors that we have an idea of what we actually want, and therefore they're more likely to propose on our projects. That's what the goal is as we think about this. So we're going to go through and focus on the specific details of what a high-performing statement of work looks like. And we'll also provide a checklist at the end. If you have an interest or you want to download this and use it for yourself, we can also provide that. But that's kind of the goal of today's presentation. So 5 main parts to this here. The overview and purpose, the future work, what you're looking to get done, itemized requirements, the schedule and the budget, and then also any unique considerations you have about this particular project. So this we're going to talk about. We're going to provide a lot of specific detail here, and we'll jump into this. The first thing to keep in mind as you go through this here is that you want to keep it clear and concise, accurate, and complete as best you can. It may not always be possible to do that, but that's kind of our intent as we think about that, right? So the first part of this, the overview and purpose. What this should describe at a high level is what and why you're looking to do this project, right? That's the very first thing here. So what does this entail? What does this consist of? The first thing I would do is provide a high-level summary that is easily understandable. Typically 1 to 2 sentences, maybe a paragraph or two, just very simple to understand what's actually going on here. I would avoid technical language, jargon, details, things that folks don't understand what's going on can make that a little bit easier here. Let me make one little change. Okay. So that's the intent of what this is going to provide for us, right? A high level of overview of the project. The second part of this is a focus on the goals, objectives, and motivation, or in other words, what is the business drivers for why you're doing this project, right? Why as a company, as an organization, are you looking to buy whatever it is, right? So some example of this, right? So let's say that you're buying a new roof. Is it to buy a new roof for the purposes of having new waterproofing, or is it to actually keep water out of the building? Obviously, our goal here, the business driver, is that we have leaks in our facility and we don't want that anymore. That's why we're doing this. If you are involved with catering or food services, is it to purely provide food for the students, or is it to make sure that in the case of universities, or if you have a sales component, is that people keep coming back, buy more of that same food, right? What's the business driver for why we're actually doing this here, right? Okay. So, and folks, I just want to make sure, is everybody hearing me okay? If you're not, please jump in here, but I think everything's okay. All right, awesome. Thanks, Corbin. Thanks, Derek. So third part of this is that to make sure you identify the key measures of success. What are the top 3 to 5 quantifiable metrics that you can look at and especially go to your boss and say, well, we bought this project, we bought this service, here's how well we know it's going, right? That's the key thing we're trying to focus on here. What metrics can you go through and think about? Now, what I have found in my professional experience is that this is really difficult for people to do. We want to sign the contract. We're not exactly sure how to evaluate that performance. But my recommendation is I would have something typically tied to cost or schedule that you can point to say, well, here's the average change order rate. Here's the average customer satisfaction, whatever it might be, is you would definitely want to spend some time going through and providing what these metrics are, right? Now, I want to do a small comment about what I actually mean by putting your overview and purpose up front. I literally mean is on the first page of your RFP document, right? So you have the cover page maybe, and then like page 2 will be out of the Word file or whatever, the PDF, is here's our statement of work, here's our overview and purpose. Many times what I see is that a lot of organizations tend to provide a almost like a history. In 1885, our company, our city did this, and it goes through all this history, which is fine. But what I found is that most vendors aren't really interested in that, right? Get to the main reason as to why we're actually having this project, right? Get to the point, make it upfront so people can actually find it. Okay, so that's overview and purpose. The second part of this is to focus on the future state, or in other words, after this project or service is done, what do you hope that the future will look like in terms of your organization, right? The way you want to do this here is describe the major deliverables and services to be provided by the vendor, and also describe what is it going to take for you as a buyer or as an FM to be 100% satisfied with this project or service, right? What's going to take to actually make this happen here? You can also attach exhibits and other high-level things, or I should say details or specifications, so that folks actually understand what is going to happen here. In terms of this future state, here's how I would structure it. I would have your overview, so clear, concise, you know what's going to happen in the future. You have your project deliverables. And what these are is a specific list of tangible outcomes that people know what's going to be provided as part of this project. So I would go through and in detail, make a checklist of all the things that they're going to do at the end or provide at the end of the service here. The third part of this is any figures, diagrams, references that might be beneficial to help explain, here's what we're looking to get done, right? I'm not saying load the entire thing down with lots of figures, but sometimes that can help make it a little bit easier to understand. And finally, if you are transitioning to one supplier to the next, or somehow there's some sort of migration time, make sure you account for that as well and think about that. Again, folks, if you have questions or comments, be sure to use the chat box. Myself and Derek are watching that, and I will certainly address your questions as we go through this. Okay, the third item here is any itemized requirements. And so I would go through and break down and provide examples, not examples, but actual specifications as to what this is going to entail. Now, when you organize these itemized requirements here, I would try to use these in terms of major categories. So for example, if you're buying a janitorial contract, one of the things you might focus on is like, well, we have different buildings on our site. So you would go through and provide the details maybe for each one of these sites. Or maybe it's in terms of types of services. Maybe it's floors, maybe it's windows, maybe it's other treatments. Providing those different types of classifications can make this easier. Now, one of the questions I see here from Dean is where would you include requirements such as relevant standards or regulatory compliance? That's a really good question, Dean. Thank you. The way I would do that is by reference. So what I mean by that is that if you have a comment or something that you want something to get done, say, see this explanation at this website that provides more detail. What I wouldn't do is I would not insert that into the statement of work in the subform part. Again, the reason why is you want to make it easier for the vendors to go through and understand what actually the requirements are. But if you have some sort of requirements that they have to meet, that will include that maybe as an appendix or an exhibit that they can go through and refer through all the details as to what that would take place. Great question, Dean. Thank you so much. So back to the itemized requirements, major categories, use exhibits. The other thing I would do is I would not require a written commentary for every single requirement, right? So for example, what I've seen that sometimes on like IT buys, so if you have to buy a new CMMS system, I have seen in some RFPs where they have a list of all these detailed requirements and it requires the vendors to go through and provide a comment on every single item. From a vendor standpoint, that is extremely cumbersome. In fact, I had a project once where we did this and the owner had approximately 600 to 700 requirements and the vendors had to go through and provide a comment on every single item. Now, I'm not saying that's not important for you to do, not at all. But what I am saying is that there has to be a time and a place to do that. And if you're just going through initially trying to solicit feedback or proposals from vendors, that upfront part is probably not the best time to do that, right? I would save that for later just to get a high level feel of what their plan is or proposal to deliver the project. The other thing I would do too, and this is this can be challenging, is to think about what are actually required versus what's actually desired. So you have things that are mandatory that you have to do this if we're going to assign a contract with this vendor. You have to do it. There's other things though that it would be nice if they did it, but they don't have to. Many times what I've seen is that we want to ask for everything under the sun and say, well, everything is mandatory, you have to do it all. But in reality is that not everything is actually like that. The reason why it's important to distinguish between mandatory and desired, because as a vendor, if I put everything as you have to do this, what's that going to do to my cost? It's going to increase cost, right? So it's important to make sure that you think about and really give some really good forethought as to what do you actually need to do versus it'd be nice to have it, but if we can't do it, that's okay too, right? Number 4 here is to provide details on the schedule and budget for the project. If you have certain deadlines when it has to be done, then I would identify that as part of your statement of work, right? So that's the schedule and also provide the budget. Now let's briefly, I want to talk about the budget here, sharing the budget. And the question here for you all is, should we share the budget as part of our statement of work? Should that be in the RFP? How much money you have budgeted for this project? Shane says yes, he's been to a few classes, he knows the answer, right? The answer in us, in my opinion, in our group's opinion, in size 400 font, is yes. Absolutely provide your budget, without a doubt. Now, let's think about this here for a second. Sometimes when folks are nervous about providing the budget or normally don't do that, the reason being is that, well, if I provide the budget and the vendors know what my budget is, they're therefore going to inflate their bid prices because they know what my budget is, right? I mean, that's the most common reason why folks don't want to do this here, right? So to stop screen share and have a brief conversation about this is that if I don't provide my budget, then the vendors have difficulty in understanding what they're actually going to do within the constraints of us as an organization. So let's say that you're concerned that the vendors are going to come in, they're going to artificially inflate the price of their bids, and therefore they're going to charge more when they actually could do it for less, right? That's our main concern. So if we think about that then, how many times have you seen a project where you actually have more money than you actually need, right? Chances are it really doesn't happen that often. Typically what happens, we actually have less money in the first place, right? That's most commonly what happens. But let's just say for a minute that you actually have more money than you actually need in your project. You have a surplus in your budget, which is great, right? This whole thing breaks down that if you provide your budget, and we're worried about the vendors inflating the prices, if one vendor were to come in and offer a realistic price about what it takes to do the work, they're automatically more competitive. And so for that reason, then, all the other vendors are aware of that, and they also are motivated to provide a competitive pricing. Now, if you have a situation where there's collusion and all sorts of other illegal things, that's a different discussion, right? But what I have found in all the thousands of procurements that we've been involved with here is that as providing that budget is really beneficial. The reason why is that if we're trying to hire expert vendors that really know what they're doing, having that budget number is one of the key pieces of information. They can't know whether or not your scope is feasible without that budget number. So we have a white paper. We can certainly talk about more about that. That's not today's focus here, but I would definitely recommend to provide the actual budget number. Now, one of the questions here is, well, do we provide a budget range or a not to exceed value? My recommendation is I would provide whatever the actual budget number is. If you have a specific dollar threshold that you can't go over, then I would say that we cannot spend more than $500,000 in this project. I've seen projects before where the owner does provide a range, and so it still leaves a certain level of ambiguity. And in fact, I've kind of seen sometimes too, it can make things more difficult for the vendors. So my recommendation is to provide the actual specific dollar amount for the project, because as a vendor, they'll really appreciate that. So that's our recommendation, right? Now, when you think about the schedule budget part of this, some other comments, it's crucial, make sure you provide that. I would provide whatever level of detail you have about your budget. So the construction budget for this project is $150,000. Estimated spend is $2 million, whatever it might be. Provide the details of what that might be. Now, if you have more questions about that, we can certainly chat about that, but that is our very clear and strong recommendation. And then finally here, wrapping things up, is any unique considerations about your project. Now, what this means here is that if you have a project that you are buying or looking to hire somebody to do something on, there might be things about it that are not like a typical or normal type of project. In that case, I would recommend to have a special section that just calls out, hey, this project is different for these reasons. We're looking to buy this IT system, but you should know that we have some unique considerations about us as an organization, right? This could be lots of different things, right? So some examples we worked on in the past, we had it was a concrete heavy project, but is also holding a cyclotron. And for those that don't know, a cyclotron is basically this big giant radioactive machine, lots of radiation, so they had to do significantly more concrete. The specs were off the charts in terms of what they had to do. That's different from a normal type of project. We've had other projects too where they're on remote locations, so it's really hard to get to. Again, calling these things out can just make it easier for your vendors to understand what may happen. Dean, the site asbestos, lead-based paint. If you see that on your projects, then I would definitely call that out. Sometimes we may not know about it, which is fine, but if you know for sure that you see, hey, we got asbestos in this location, I would definitely call that out, because as a vendor, they can better prepare a strategy to deliver an effective project if they know what that is. You may not always know, which is fine, but again, that's what our focus is here. Keep in mind here, our goal here is not perfection. We could spend all the time in the world and money in the world, right, developing an amazing statement of work, but that's going to cost a lot of money, right? We have to do the best we can within our resource constraints. On the other hand, though, we can't totally miss the target, right? If we're not spending some initial effort to go through and think about what's going to make us happy in the day, what's our financial picture look like, what are the major tasks of this project, doing these things as a vendor can help us get better pricing, better proposals, and can really optimize or make things more efficient in terms of our project. At the end of the day here, if our scope of work is too open-ended or maybe too prescriptive, this can also have an impact. So I want to close out today with a very short example of what happens if our scope of work, may not be accurate. In this particular example, this is a university's FM group, and part of what they had to do was to collect recycling throughout the campus and then take it to the local recycling facility, and then that's basically what they had to do. They had to recycle. So 5,000 tons of waste across an urban area. As part of their scope of work, they specified that for the company that picks up these materials, the company has to provide an adequate fleet of collection vehicles, should be used and maintained by the vendor. They also said is that it is the owner's expectation that the collection vehicles be designated for service a minimum of less than 2 years old at the start of the contract. So they told the vendors the vehicles you use for our sites had to be less than 2 years old. Now, the reason why they're doing this is not nefarious or trying to be difficult, but because they wanted to make sure that they had the most efficient tools, efficient equipment on site, and they could better measure their sustainability goals. So they said, you have to use brand new trucks for our site. The other thing they said inside of the statement of work is that in order to measure, or excuse me, in order to support accurate measurements towards our sustainability goals, all vehicles have to be solely dedicated to us as the client and cannot be used for other sites. Now, the reason why they have this requirement is that they want to know how much stuff they're recycling and not have that mixed up with, if they go by the city of Charlotte or whoever and also combine all these materials into one truck, right? Because then they'll have an accurate measurement. So they said you can't use it, right? So what is this going to result in? Everybody think about this. Brand new vehicles, and they can't be used for anybody else. What's going to happen to your average bid price? Everybody together, thumbs up, right? It's going to be much higher when we do that, right? So in fact, what we found in this project here is that the average proposal price was 50% over the budget. In fact, there was one proposal that was 106% over the budget, right? The reason why this is a concern here, and the lesson for you all to take away from this is that if you find yourself doing the means and methods of how to do something in your statement of work, that's probably too prescriptive. If you find yourself telling the vendors how to do their job, that's not what the goal is. What they should have done in this case here is say that we want to track our sustainability goals. We want to track how many tons of material that we're recycling every month. And so as part of your proposal for us, please identify how you're going to do that. We don't need to tell them, well, here's how you need to do it. You need to specify, hey, here's our goal. You provide us as the owner the best way to actually accomplish that. Does that kind of make sense? The means and methods versus what the goals are. Two different things, and make sure we don't tell the vendors how to actually do their job. So again, if our scope is too prescriptive, it increases cost and makes things more difficult, frustrating, and at the end of the day, this brings risk to the project. Now, has anybody ever used IFMA Engage? IFMA Engage. It is a fantastic resource that IFMA has put together where basically it's like an online discussion board. See, Derek's used it. I know several of you folks have used that before. It is a fantastic resource. If you have questions, you're trying to learn about things, IFMA Engage is by far a fantastic resource for FM. So be sure to check it out. Derek, I don't know if you can, but if you can find the URL, drop that in the chat box and give folks a chance to take a look at that. One thing I've seen though on IFMA Engage is that sometimes a very common question that people will ask here is, does anyone have an RFP for fill in the blank type of service? Does anybody have an RFP for a contract that it could see, right? That's the question that's commonly asked. What's intended by that question, I think, is when somebody says that, I'm not sure what task I need my vendor to do. Do you have any recommendations, right? That's kind of what we're looking for here. What is needed though, and kind of what our recommendation for a new perspective is to ask questions like this. What major challenges do my customers face, and how do I find an expert vendor to help me solve them, right? So it's not so much about the specific details of the RFP or the statement of work, although that's important. It's really about thinking, why are people frustrated? In my site, what common things are people always talking about, and how do I mitigate those issues, right? If we start changing our focus to more focus on what's giving problems at the end of the day, It's less effort the more to the right-hand side we think about this. It's more success, and at the end of the day, it costs less if we have a different perspective about focusing on what are the main things that we need to think about. So in summary here, the key takeaways, a couple major things. A good statement of work will help you get better pricing and a more realistic schedule. It does not have to be perfect. Folks, please hear that it doesn't have to be perfect. But if we take some time and effort to go through the things about we talked about today, that will help it get it better. A good statement of work has 5 major components to it: the overview and purpose, the future state, itemized requirements, the schedule and the budget, and finally, any unique considerations. And then finally here is include your budget. Be sure to include your budget, because at the end of the day, that will help the vendors understand what is the financial constraints that you face as an owner organization.
Join us on the third Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern U.S. Time to learn from our FM docs while connecting with other facility managers from around the world. Register today at simplerfoundation.org/FM-doctor.